Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to this week's weekly Dharma gathering. My name is Shantae Paradigm Smalls, and I'm the one of the co-founders and the curator of Weekly Dharma Gathering. I'm really excited tonight to have my good friend and amazing teacher, Aarti Tejuja, who's teaching us tonight. And tonight's teaching is called Unearthing the Heart of Transformative Justice. Sorry. So first, Aarti will lead us through a guided meditation, or however she's going to do it, some version of a talk, and then we'll have a Q&A. So tonight's session is being recorded. So if you prefer not to be seen, please feel free to stop your camera or mute your camera. And please note you will also be recorded if you when asking a question on camera. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question on camera, you can use the chat feature to ask a question, and it will go to the hosts. So that's both Aarti and I will read the question out so our teacher can answer. And you can ask a question in the chat box anytime. The recording of tonight's gathering can be accessed within 48 hours, usually shorter, but within a 48-hour period via your purchased products on your Vimeo Weekly Dharma Gathering account, and you'll receive an email from the Weekly Dharma Gathering email once it's ready. So I'm just gonna read our teacher's bio and then I'll turn it over to Aarti. Aarti Tejuja, she, her, is a sacred space holder and facilitator, a transformative portal builder, a healer, and a social activist. Aarti has also been a community organizer, a youth mentor, and advocate for those impacted by the current punitive justice system. Aarti currently co-owns Joyful Ground with Sojourner Wright, and with the help of their ancestors and spirit guides, they create transformative portals that take groups of people on inner and outer journeys of healing, decision-making, conflict resolution, celebration, uncovering biases, and more. These portals are facilitated using embodiment practices, rest practices, healing the inner child through play, transformative justice, emergence, and element healing. Aarti lives with her partner, Matt Lentz, and two kitties, Fiona and Buttercup. Most of her ancestors are from, now, how does that say, it's Sindh? Sindh? Okay. Currently in Pakistan, formerly in India prior to the partition in 1947. She lives in a house that is on the lands of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, the Fox, the Kickapoo, and Illinois nations. Present day called Berwyn, Illinois, a very close suburb of Chicago. Aarti also lives on the technology superhighway where she can be found on Zoom. So at the end of tonight, I'll give a pitch. Someone asked a question. I can tell you how you can become a subscriber, or actually Sheena's coming and maybe I'll ask her to do that. So you can become a monthly or yearly subscriber. So stick around after the Q&A and we will do that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our teacher, Aarti. Please teach us.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with all of you today and be talking about this topic. So we're going to start, speaking of, that was a perfect intro because we're going to start off a little bit with a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement, this land acknowledgement particularly was created by the American Indian Center here in Chicago. And it's we're only going to do a very short version of this land acknowledgement. So if you know the Indian tribes that or the indigenous people that were on the lands that you are from, you are most welcome at the point where we get to it to speak them into the space or write them in the chat if you know. And if you don't know, you are always welcome to look that up later at a later moment. Okay. So we'll just take our seats and just feel into the ground that we're on. And you can even put your hand on the ground. Just feel into the land for a moment. Put your attention onto the land. In recent years, it has become a trend to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the indigenous peoples of a particular area through a land acknowledgement. This type of activity is designed to bring more awareness and understanding of the history of indigenous peoples and their territories. But a land acknowledgement should be more than that. It should be a call to rethink our own relationship with the environment and the histories of all peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Chicago is the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes like the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox also called this area home. So if you know those that occupied the lands before us, you're welcome to speak their names now at this moment. And just bring your attention to the lands or type them into the chat. And if you don't know, just take a moment to feel into the lands and feel into those that were here before us. Piscataway. Squamish Nation, Coast Salish nations, born and grew up on Treaty 7 nation lands. Okay, thank you. So tonight, I'm gonna switch up the schedule a little bit, just a little bit. And the reason for that is we're going to start off with a talk, and then we're going to get into a contemplative practice that's based off the talk. And that's why we're switching it up a little bit. So we'll get a chance to not only visit the topic of transformative justice, but also feel into it a bit in our bodies. And the way I really like to speak about this is we need to make this personal. We really need to make it personal. So it's not just about harm that's committed out there, but what is the punitive view that's going on right now that's happening in here? And so we're really going to explore, tap into that a little bit. And if you're confused and you don't know exactly what that means, that's okay, because that's what this is about. So I'm going to first take you through a little slideshow. So it's a little bit easier with slides in this. I don't typically use slides in a lot of my talks, but in this case, I found finding it to be a little bit helpful. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. So just to begin, I really wanted to share this topic because it feels very much pertinent, particularly in Dharma communities right now, right? And often in Dharma communities, we're talking about Buddha nature, and we're talking about basic goodness, and we're talking about this goodness of humanity and goodness of people. And yet, when harm happens, we often don't actually know what to do in many of our communities. We don't know where to go with that. We don't know how to kind of deal with that. And what I really love, particularly about this view of harm and how to work with harm, transformative justice, is that it really is a view that's based on the goodness of people and Buddha nature. So before we really get started, it really helps to define these two words, because I find myself using these words a lot when I talk about transformative justice. So it just helps to be on the same page as to what I mean by these words. And so trauma. So trauma, I'm defining as a distressing or disturbing psychological or physical experience had by you or in your ancestry that negatively affects the way you move, respond, and perceive in the world. So you can either be aware of your trauma or you could maybe not even realize that it's there. In transformative justice, healing is a personal and collective commitment to transform trauma so that we do not perpetuate harm. When harm is committed, it is an opportunity to heal trauma for everyone. So another thing to mention is that transformative justice, of course, doesn't come from me. It comes from a lot of people who have done a lot of work in this area, who have been doing this for years and who have really committed themselves to this. And it comes from trans Black communities who really couldn't go to the traditional system when harm got committed in their community. They couldn't just go to the police, right? Because that wasn't a safe place for them to go. So they really had to figure out, how are they going to deal with harm in their communities? And so some of this view is really coming from there, from that place. We just really want to acknowledge that, this is coming from somewhere. It really has a lineage of its own, if you will. But I think we can really learn from that. We can really learn from that and really start to kind of dive in. And really, this is also meant to be a very, a taste of this view. So hopefully it whets your appetite enough to want to go further and want to explore this more. And I'm going to be sharing resources with you that help you to do that. So our current society's view of harm, what does that look like? So that's today's view. So we have this view in our society that bad people do bad things. So there's the bad people who commit this harm, and these bad people have to be punished for their harm that they've committed. And in fact, sometimes those bad people are not even redeemable. And so often that looks like jail time for somebody, right? And then what I mean by not redeemable is sometimes people come out and they are held with this record. They have a record. And that kind of puts a stamp on them that says, you're not redeemable. You're never redeemable. In fact, you're always going to have this stamp that you've been to jail and you're a bad person. So that's one idea that we have in our world. And then what is this punishment? So oftentimes this punishment we look at as a resolution. In other words, we have someone commits harm, we prove that they do harm, and then the resolution is perhaps jail time, or it's a fine, or whatever we decide that the punishment is just the final resolution, and that's what we call justice. Oftentimes we call that justice. So, and then if there's no punishment, right, then we say, well, either, they did it and justice just wasn't served, or we say they didn't do it. And so therefore, there's nothing that is going to happen. That's it. That's the end of it. We proved that they didn't do it and that was it. So there's no resolution. That is the resolution. Then it's interesting because we have typically we have set up one structure for when harm is caused. So, and that structure often looks like we see some harm that's happening and we may pick up the phone and say, well, let's call the police. Right? That's the kind of structure we have in place to deal with harm in our society, is we have this authority figure that's going to help us to deal with the harm. So, and that may look different in different communities. So it may be like we have something in place in our community. We have a group of people or something that's who you go to when harm is, happening. Or like maybe in a school, it's like we go to the principal when a harm is committed. But it's a designated person or a group of people that deals with the harm, and we send them there. Then oftentimes the harm is based on, like, we decide whether something has happened or not happened based on our evidence or proof. Like, we look for evidence or proof. Like, did the person create harm? What's the proof that they did it? Then it often relies on our relationships being weak or even non-existent. So oftentimes the harm that we're talking about, it happens between people we know. It happens, amongst people we're familiar with in some way or another. So what do I mean by it relies on relationships being weak? So oftentimes our neighbors and our wider community, we know them, but we don't know them, right? We haven't really spent time really knowing people deeply necessarily. And so what happens is we might sort of know them, or we kind of know them, or we think we know them, and then a harm is committed, and both the person that has been harmed, well, the person that has been harmed immediately says, I want a punitive approach. Let's call the police. I want justice, right? That choice is made. Whereas if we had relationships, we might wonder, do we want to choose a punitive approach in this circumstance, right? If we know this person really well. So it's really relying on our relationships being weak. And then the last kind of point is that it's not preventative. So somebody may cause harm, and we may decide that their punishment is jail time. When they come out of jail, there's nothing to say they won't recommit the harm, right? There's nothing to we don't put anything in place necessarily that says, like, we're going to give this person some sort of healing tool so that when they come out, that's going to prevent them from doing it again, right? So it's not a preventative view. So what's a transformative view then of harm? What is this transformative justice thing? So the transformative justice view is actually saying that no human being and no person is inherently bad or irredeemable. And it's saying that people cause harm because they have trauma. And it's also saying that healing trauma is possible, both in a personal sense and in a collective sense. So trauma could really come from, something that has happened to me directly in my family, perhaps, or it could be something generational, right? It could be, this is what happened in my ancestry, and I'm holding that trauma of my ancestry. So this view is saying that there is no person that is bad here, but rather that harm is caused because there's something that has not been healed. And then it's saying those who are harmed are offered healing. So if somebody comes and says, harm was committed to me, they immediately, regardless of whether that's true or not true, they still receive healing, right? Because if you really think about it, either they've really been harmed and they need healing and support around that, or they're making it up. Let's say worst case scenario, they're totally making this up and they're coming here. They still need healing from something, right? So there's still the view that whoever has been harmed, when they come, there's some healing approach that needs to happen. So it's either whether, and that is not reliant on whether the person who committed the harm admits it. So that's irrelevant. What we're saying here is that this person that has been harmed needs healing. So that's one thing. What we're also saying is that the person who has caused harm also needs a healing process. Now, we're not saying that they both need the same healing process. Their healing may look very, very different from one another. But we are saying that something has happened here, and the root of it is some sort of trauma that we might have to get to the bottom of. And the healing processes may look very different for the two. And another thing to kind of say is that when the person that has caused harm is offered a healing process, we are not saying that they're admitting their guilt. They are not saying, yes, I want the healing process because I'm guilty. Maybe they're not guilty. Maybe they haven't done anything. Maybe it's they haven't really committed much harm, or maybe the whole thing is made up, right? But what we're saying is that there's still a healing process that needs to happen because there's still somebody coming forward. So what needs to happen here, right? So the whole thing is based inside of this healing process. And if the person that's committed harm chooses not to accept and says, you know what, I want nothing to do with this. I'm not admitting anything. I'm not going to be part of a process. I want nothing to do with this. Then we have to look at boundaries. That's when we have to look at boundaries, right? Because if they're not willing to do it, to do the work that might be involved, if they're not willing to be part of this community in that way, then maybe we need to say, is this a community for you, right? Because this is what we're doing in this community. Is this the right community for you? And we also can't say that in 6 months, this person isn't going to come back and say, you know what, I do want to be part of this healing process. I just needed a little time to really think about things. So there's no set time, right? That may be possible that somebody goes and has done something and then needs a little time to process it on their own and is then ready to come forward. And that does not, again, hinge on the person that needs healing because they've been harmed. So we're not looking at it as one thing. We're looking at it as two separate things, right? And which may come together at some point, right, in a healing process. And then this last one is that accountable relationships are created even before harm occurs inside of a community. So I'm going to go to the next slide to explain that one in a lot more detail. So what does that mean? So I love this diagram. I did not come up with this diagram. It came from Mia Mingus, who is a transformative justice practitioner. And I love this diagram. I think it's fantastic, but that's who came up with that. And you could Google her and actually find lots of stuff by her. She's a wonderful teacher. So I'm going to start with this side of the diagram. So oftentimes harm happens. And when we say harm happens, what we actually mean is this is where harm has happened. These two areas here. Someone has committed a crime. Someone is in the hospital. Someone has been attacked. It is violent. It is physical. It is psychologically emotional. Like it is like the worst harm, right? It's like just something horrible has happened. And that's where we tend to get involved. We're like, okay, now we got to get involved. And that's when, like, we make the call to go to the authority, right? That's this point right here in a community. And what the problem with that is that when things come and escalate to this level, that is very, very challenging to deal with. And I think we all know that. It's very challenging, right? Some really bad harm has happened. How are we going to deal with this? And sometimes, and so there is processes for this in transformative justice. They're called community accountability processes, which you can look up. And actually, there's some really great resources I'll send you on this. Even examples of actual community of accountability processes that have happened. But a lot of these community accountability processes that happen here sometimes take 2 years to resolve. 2-3 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have a lot of time in my life. I'm impacted by the system just as much as the next person, and there's not a lot of time. And if I was told I need to be part of a community accountability process that lasted 3 years, like I feel like this, So I'm not saying that these aren't good and they shouldn't happen. They need to happen. But the good news is that we can actually prevent harm from happening even before we get here. So this diagram is really marking the severity of violence over time. And it's saying that the severity of violence gets more drastic potentially over time. So if we let it go. So over here, right before, you see potentially a friend who's using racist or misogynistic language. Or you see a person in your community treating someone else in a poor way, right? Maybe they're yelling at them, maybe, there's something going on here, right? Now, oftentimes this misogynistic language seems like, oh, maybe not so harmful. I don't know, like, oh, okay, we let it slide. But what actually happens is this misogynistic, racist language goes into treating another person poorly, which then escalates into more violent harm over time, right? And that's how we get here. We don't get here overnight, right? This stuff is happening first, and then this stuff is happening. So if we in our community can start to work with this, right, we can actually prevent a lot of this stuff from even happening in the first place. So much about transformative justice is actually happening here, right? So what can we do here before it ever gets to this point? And that's where we can spend so much of our time, is in this box here that I sort of drew in here. And even better, even before it gets, so this is still harm, right? If a friend uses misogynistic or racist language or says something, that's still a form of harm. It's not as bad as this, perhaps, but it's still a form of harm. And so we can even stop that from happening. And this is things like where we can completely stop harm from even that level. So it's training, right? You're all here listening to this transformative justice talk, for example, right? And now you have an idea of transformative justice, and maybe you're going to go further with transformative justice. We can't, when horrible stuff happens, when these worst crimes are committed, we're not going to take the people that are involved and say, hey, let's do a transformative justice process. They're going to go, what? Like, call the police, like, get me, some help, That's not the time to introduce this stuff, right? The time to introduce it in our community is before it even happens. And so if our community is doing this, right, we're all educating ourselves around racist language. We're all training in this stuff that we need to. We're all doing a bunch of relationship building together. Then by the time it actually gets here, if it gets here at all, which we hope we've prevented it from even getting here, but if it happens to get here, we know about this transformative justice because we've been doing it. We've been building relationships, and chances are this harm happens, the two people might even have a close relationship, right? And they may choose to have a transformative process because they may say, I don't want a punishment here. I love this person, even though they've committed harm. So we're trying to start here, really, in a community with TJ. And then there's a thing called creating accountability pods, which I have a great resource on that too, I can send out. But it's really like, an example is like having a few people like in a community where everybody's got 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever pods of people, like 2 or 3 people in a pod. And we're committed, or the 3 of us or the 4 of us or whatever, are committed to holding each other accountable. We're going to have an accountable relationship together. So it's kind of a group of people that you can go to when, say, you have used racist language and someone says something to you and you're like, I needed someone to process this with. Like, these are your people that you can process this with. Or something has happened to you. Somebody was treating you poorly and you're like, I don't know where to go with this. You go to your pod. And your pod sort of helps you in that, right? These are people that are going to hold you accountable and you're holding them accountable. And so we can build that inside of our communities. We can build these pods. So that's a lot. And we're going to get into just a little exercise now. I want to get into a little exercise, and then we're going to do a Q&A. So something that's interesting to me about transformative justice and about justice in general is this punitive system that we have created actually lives in our bodies. It actually comes in it's coming from here. this larger system always comes from the fact that we have punitive mindsets. And so this exercise is really about that. It's exploring that a little bit and sort of seeing like, how do we get to this point? How do we get to this? How did we create this? So what I want you to do is we're going to need a writing utensil and some paper. So if you don't have that, just grab a piece of paper. It could be a journal, doesn't matter. Just going to be short. So what I want you to do is think of a time where somebody punished you, either in a direct way or an indirect way. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So for example, and this can be any time period in your life. It could be like when you were a little kid. It could be like last week. It could be today, it doesn't matter. But just any time in your life where you felt like someone punished you. So like my mom, for example, and this is a little more indirect. My mom was clearly not very happy that I didn't come home for her birthday this year and in December. And so when we were on the phone, she kind of did the whole passive aggressive thing of like, oh, I'll just be lonely. And it was a little cute, but then it was a little not cute because it just kept going. And, I could tell there was sort of like trying to punish me a little bit in there, so it was like this passive aggressive punishment going on. So it could be something like that, or it could be something that's just really direct. But just take 5 minutes, think about it, and write it down. Okay. And it might help you to free write if you can't think of anything. So give you another minute. Okay. So now let's get into our bodies a little bit. So I want you to just roll your shoulders back. Start to move a little bit. And maybe your head. And just start to move your arms. And if you feel like standing up, you could stand up and move a bit. You're welcome to stay seated if you don't feel like standing up. But just really feel a sense of your body. Stretch, a little move. And now what I want you to do is bring to mind your story, the story that you just wrote on your piece of paper of a time that you felt like somebody punished you. And I want you to feel into how that makes you feel. How did that make you feel? So now make a shape with your body, any shape. And then make another shape. And now what I want you to do is find a shape that you can make with your body that really embodies how you felt when someone punished you. So for example, if we were to use my mom, you know, my shape would look like and just go ahead and just get into that shape. And on camera, you can turn your camera off for this. And just feel into what that feels like in your body in this moment. Just notice. Okay. You can come out of that. Uh-oh. I don't see the whiteboard on my Zoom. Do you have the whiteboard?
Yes. So if you, let me try to find it. Oh, it might not be on, we might not have that activated. I'm sorry.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll just do it in the chat. Okay.
Yeah,
So
everyone can see the chat.
Can you all see the chat? Okay. So what are some things you felt? What are some things you felt? Just some words that came up. You can just free form unmute yourself and just, there you go. Righteous, annoyed, indignant, defensive, angry, withdrawn. Irritated. Yes, you can unmute and speak it into the space too. isolated, small. Any other? Constricted. Mhm. Anything else? Okay. Vengeful, disappointed, indifferent. Okay. So now I want us to go back to our writing, back to our writing utensil. And this time, I want you to think of a time where you punish someone else, either in a direct way or an indirect way. So for example, my husband did not do the dishes last week. I did all the dishes like nonstop, and I was very frustrated with this. And instead of having a conversation, I just blew up. And I wanted to I wanted to punish him with that. And so I just let him have it. And yeah. So that's an example. But think of a time where you punish someone. And we're not going to share these. So, feel this is just for you. So anything that arises for you. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to come up and write something out. Give you another minute. Okay. So this time, either cameras on, cameras off, whatever works for you. I want you to feel into, what did it feel like when you were punishing in that moment? What did it feel like? Take yourself back there to that moment. What did it feel like? And I want you to take a shape of like what it felt like. And then once you have that shape, I want you to feel into, what does it feel like now? What does it feel like now? Having done this, what does it feel like for you now in your body? And then just move into that shape. And you might have to just move around a little bit to find it. And just let yourself feel that for a moment. Okay. Let's go to the chat again. What are some words that arose for you that time? What came up? What feelings came up? Or you can speak them out loud too, if you want. You don't have to put them in the chat. Loneliness, regret, distance. Interestingly, the same as being punished. Righteous, indignant, indifferent, annoyed, embarrassed. Angry, violent, disappointed. Self-righteous. Many of the same feelings as when I was being punished. Indignant. Anything else? Small and constricted, still. Not as small as when being punished. Powerful, foolish, embarrassed. Powerful, yeah. Yeah. So if we're on a whiteboard, we have all the words up, but since we're in a chat, just take a moment and look at your chat from the words before and the words now. Just take a moment and just look at these words. And now let's type in the chat or say it out loud. What did these words, what does this, reading this, what does that feel like? What does that feel like right now? What does this all feel like? What comes up when you read these? Heartbreak.
If I could speak, I think for me, there's a sadness in the detachment and sort of the, the separation between the beings in those instances.
It also makes it's hard to tell which one was the punishment and which one where I was doing the punishing and which one what side was it, because there's a lot. Yeah, there's pain on both sides.
Separated from others. Anything else? Any other reflections?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, so these are the feelings and the foundations of the communities we're building. This is it. So it's not enough to say, a lot of times we think of restorative justice as or transformative justice or justice as something out there, but actually it's all here. It's all right here, right? And so what has to shift, right? What has to shift has to be from here. So oftentimes we just think of it as out there. And so, sometimes maybe we choose this punitive approach because it's just easier than maybe having to look at this, easier than having to maybe feel this, because this doesn't always feel good, right? So I think what's interesting about this is that Dharma communities particularly, we're all about tapping into this. And so the way I see it is we could do this. We could really start to shift. And we can do this in our own communities, that it's possible, that it really is something that's possible. And again, this is just a very, very small snippet and a taste of what we're talking about with transformative justice. But I hope that it kind of makes you kind of see it and just think about it and feel into it, right? That these two sides, the words are so similar, right? And that it's coming out of this place of trauma on all the sides, right? It's coming out of this very human place. And it's not about the punitive approach of it being bad and good, but it's something else. It's something else that we need to explore together. So I'm going to open it up now and and take a breath. Let's take a breath. Take a breath together. And I like to take a breath and just shake it out. So take a breath together and just. So yeah, let's open it up. What's coming up for you? Anything you want to ask or share or noticings? Really, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that transformative justice is about. I absolutely believe there's like nobody who's throwaway, and I want to see something other than the way justice is meted out and, in our culture and country and everything. But it all seems really cumbersome and really time intensive. So how does that happen, and how does it get scaled so it can work really?
Do you remember that slide, the very last slide of the graphic? Let me pull it up again. Do you remember?
Yes.
This one.
Right. Sure.
So I think, right, and there's no one thing to just say is that there's no one person that has figured all this out. And there's not a neat approach to this. It's not neat. It's not, I think that's the current justice system really tries to make everything so like in categories and neat. And this approach is not neat because this is just not how humans are. We aren't like that. We don't fit into categories like that. And so it's, when we're talking about transformative justice, we are now all part of the discussion of transformative justice. There is not, we can watch things from people and learn from people who are doing this work, are on the ground actually doing this work. There's a lot to be learned there. But at the same time, we in our communities are going to have to be involved, right? And we're going to have to use our minds and to try to uncover like what are alternative solutions to this punitive approach. And some of it is just what we just did in the exercise, right? We have to root it out here, because even though we may believe it up here, like I'm the same as you, I really don't want to have a punitive approach, but I can't say with certainty that it's not in here. The fact is I'm still yelling at my husband for the dishes instead of like sitting down and coming, and like really like being gentle about it. So what is that, right? That's for me to explore. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is that this part here, this part that's circled, that's really where it's going to feel less daunting, because this is daunting. I'll agree. Like this feels like overwhelming to me. And I'm not saying that there aren't approaches to this, but this sure feels a lot more doable for me personally. Like I feel like I can start to learn this stuff. I'm already listening to podcasts. I'm talking to other people. I have people that hold me accountable that I can go to, right? I know how to build that. I'm part of communities that are building that. I have, tools to talk about it, right? I have relationships where I can go to my friend and say, hey, I think that thing that you said the other day was not so great. I heard you the way you talked to your husband and I'm disappointed and I feel like we should talk about that. What's that about? Right. Or allowing someone to come to me and saying, hey, Aarti, I know you're mad at Matt right now, but like the way I heard you yelling at him for the washing the dishes, like we should talk about that a little bit. Like what's going on there with you? Right. And so I can see, and I can hold myself accountable to that and work with that. Right. So it's starting in me, but it's also like I'm open to that. I have friends, there's like an openness, right? Because otherwise we get defensive. If we don't have that mutual agreement with each other, that, what, we want to create an accountable community. And so therefore we're going to call each other in. It can be gentle. It can be gentle, but we're going to say something to each other when stuff is going awry, right? Like when we see that thing in our community happening, we're going to go there. We're not going to be afraid of that. And the people who are doing it are part of the community and know that it's okay for you to come to them and say that. They have also signed up for like, yes, like, please come to me and tell me if I'm using misogynistic language. It's almost like an invitation. And you're building that into the culture, right? You're building that sense of accountability. It's in there already. So everybody in your community is clear that's what you're doing. Right? So it's all the education up front, but that's what we're doing now.
It also sounds like compassion and self-compassion are really just at the core, at the base of making this work. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. please.
First, I'd like to say thank you, Aarti, for this hour and for sharing this with us. I think that's been it's very important for me in my life right now to sort of really see the manifestations of transformative justice and how I can sort of follow through with that. But one of the things that I struggle with still is, and you touched on it, you know, in your diagram, and I guess it'll be over here, is, you know, when the real violence does happen from people, you know, people that are, you know, acting from trauma and really bringing violence on a community or to people, and you know, when we don't have 2 years to really sort of like work through that and put them in, you know, what are some of the immediate healing spaces that we can offer them and things like that, knowing that we're living in a system. I mean, here in Minneapolis, that, you know, it's particularly poignant right now, you know, a punitive system that, you know, maybe can break us from that at this time.
So I don't know if there's, I mean, I don't know what's out there in the communities that you're in. Like there probably are people inside of your own communities in the cities that you're in or the places that you're from that are doing this sort of work, that are starting to look into transformative and restorative justice too. So I would encourage you to start to get involved in that and start to talk to those people and get to know who they are and see what kind of work is happening in that. Right. I don't think there's a one size fits all to this because so much of this is like, I mean, when I say like, I don't have 2 years to figure this out, it's part of that is because I live in a culture that doesn't allow me to have 2 years to figure it out. Right. I mean, I live in a very speedy culture. Right. And we're all kind of trapped in that. Right. So it's part of the whole thing is part of a larger system. Right. And so there's not a perfect solution to this. But I think what we can do, in my sense, is that we can figure out how we can take the people that are involved in such a big harm and how can we actually support them. So if there's a huge harm that has been committed, you can't just say, you know what, I'm not going to call the police because I believe in transformative justice. If the people involved want you to call the police, you have to call the police. Like you can't just say no to that. If they are asking you for a punitive approach, you don't have the right to just deny them of that. So it's like, right. And then the other thing is that if somebody commits a harm and then the police do get involved and it goes through the justice system, I've seen approaches where, so say the person is incarcerated for the harm that they've committed. They're probably not going to get much healing potentially in the place they're going. Maybe they, I mean, depends on the situation, but they probably aren't. So you could find ways as a community to offer them healing while they're in the system, right? So that's kind of it's not a perfect approach there, but, you know, so because they're in a punitive system, that's what we have. But there might be ways of offering that kind of healing and support to them if they're wanting that. Again, like so much of this starts with a community saying, I'm going to commit to this approach. And then we're going to educate everybody in the community about this approach. And we're all going to come together to decide like, okay, so what about this scenario? What would we do in this scenario together? What is the decision we're all making together if there is something like that done? Right. And then I can share with you, there's like community accountability processes for real harm that does get done that do take really long periods of time that are also possible options, you know, depending on like the situation. So that's just a little snippet, but.
Thank you. And thank you, Shante, for the reference there in the chat.
It's definitely not a one size fits all solution. There's no, you know, if we go to that, it's kind of like what we have. It's like, right, there's a right or a wrong kind of answer. So. Anything else? Anything else that's arising?
I'm wondering if you could say something about, so, you know, when there's harm committed in a community, like when it's, you know, particularly when a lot of times these harms are, whether it's really egregious or lesser, it's in a community where people know each other. But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is like our addiction to, you know, the cop inside. You know, people talk about defund the police, but we have to like defund the police in us, as you know, as your exercise was showing. And I'm thinking about this at like my work, where you know, we're trying to do some the pods that you're talking about, and some structural stuff from the HR director. She's really incredible. And there's a lot of pushback, particularly along racial lines, because a lot of the people in HR are women of color and people of color, and they're trying to do more expansive kinds of things. And they're really getting kind of thrown under the bus because they're not, you know, they're not punishing the abusers. And there's only so much the human resources can do if people aren't bringing criminal charges, right? And so what ends up happening is that the focus goes, because people want a kind of copy system, the focus goes from someone, in this particular case, someone who did like really egregious stuff to students, and someone who facilitated that, and then, you know, lawsuits, and a whistleblower got fired. And then the focus becomes on these inept women of color. Mm-hmm. Because people are so focused on some kind of payback, you know, for real cruel stuff. Yeah. And I'm wondering, I guess my question is, how do you get buy-in from people who think that's and these are often self-described liberals and progressives, but when it comes down to it, they want the hammer. And how do you get people to buy in? You know, we've talked about it, there's been invitations, but how do you get people to buy in? Or particularly when the punitive system isn't working anyway. So I'm just wondering what your experience, we've been kind of struggling with this for a couple of years now. So I'm just wondering what some thoughts.
If you do figure that out, you should share it with the whole world. Because, right? I mean, it's the whole thing, right? It's like, otherwise we'd have different system right now. We could convince everybody this is the right thing to do. But I think it's a lack of education around trauma, you know, and like where that originates, and people have to be able to see their own trauma, right, in like their own family system, and have to be willing to go there. And I think that pushback really comes from like, I don't want to go there. I'm not willing to face my own shit. And so therefore, what you're really asking me is for me, what you're really asking me is for me to look at my own stuff. Like, if, you know, because, and I don't want to go there because that's too scary for me, right? There's too much fear there of like, then I've opened up a whole Pandora's box of I don't know what, and right. And so it's almost like people need to like really understand that it's actually about them, like it's about their own healing or something, you know, like we have to somehow get people to understand that this isn't about like all of the other things. It's about you. It's about your own healing. Like, we're offering you a doorway into your own healing, and you don't have to be afraid of that doorway. It's actually like, it's sort of the place I was thinking about, like, it's the place where like addictions come from, right? It's a place where like we go to all these other things because we're not wanting to do this inner work because it's so scary. And it's so like such a like, oh my gosh, like we have to face that. And I think that's what people are most afraid of. So it's easier to go, he's bad, she's bad, they're bad, you know, let's lock them up because they did this horrible thing. Because then we have to look in here. This approach is telling us we have no choice but to look in here. And that, I think, is really scary. And then you top off all this other stuff, right? Like there's that view is perpetuated in so many facets, like religion, traditional religion, you know, like the bad and the good. And like, it's that dynamic is everywhere. So we're not just, it's like we're undoing a much larger thing than even this punitive system. We're undoing just the whole dynamic of good and bad and the way we categorize and the trauma that's inside. that's the deep trauma that's inside. And, until people are willing to face it, we will just continue to be in this. We will continue to be in this. But I think it's much harder, I think, in the systems that you're talking about. Like you're talking about a system where you don't have very much like buy-in, and you don't have a community that necessarily knows each other that well, or like and it's a big system. I think that we have to probably start to put this stuff inside of small organizations, right? Or small communities, or like Dharma communities, I think are more doable. Like you could do it there conceivably, right? Because there's not that many of you. And so if we could start to build it like that, then what I think happens is it trickles outward, because people have a sense of like, oh, I belong to a community that's doing this. And now I can maybe bring it to some of my other communities and so I think it'll trickle out like that. That's kind of how I see it happening, but I don't know everything. It's just my sense. But if you do come up with that perfect answer, like, please, like,
Thank you.
call me up first and like, because I want to know. Yeah. But I'm glad that there are people who want to do this, that are in HR and all that, right? That's really good news. And, I don't know. I figure I might be dead before any of this actually starts to, but like we can start planting the seeds right now, right? We can, like, here we are, the four of us right now, and we had some more people, and we'll have more people like, on this recording, and we'll start planting seeds in the communities that we're in. And it could start with our families. Our family, we don't talk about it that much. We think about community as like something outside of our family, but maybe it starts there. Like that's not the case for everybody, that they're going to be able to do it in their families, but maybe they're your immediate family, or maybe you have some people in your family wanting to look at it there, it could start like that. Yeah. What do y'all think about this? What do you think? What do you think about this whole approach?
Yeah, for me, I mean, like I said, I think it's really important for me in my growth and sort of understanding, how to really, and you're touching on it now, recognize the trauma. That to me, that's building the responses to the stimuli around me, and how do I, break those patterns. And this is a healthy and a healing way to do that. That's about love and compassion. That I think is very important. And it, to be honest, I've always been terrified of getting called up to jury duty, because I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I know that that's a complicated person in that chair, and I don't know how I could ever do that. And this is, helping me find a way, like, oh, if you can approach that in a way that communicates a space that is about growth and not about punishment, I think that it's really essential to us as beings. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. I appreciate being with all of you this evening and talking about this. And yeah, it gives me just like, when I talk about this and we're doing this in a group, it gives me just a little bit of hope, in a world that's so complicated right now and so complex and so painful. Like, it gives me just a little, like, to know that that this exists, that this view can actually exist, and that there are people who are actually like chewing on this and like really feeling it out, and that I get to be part of feeling it out. Now you all are feeling it out, like we're all doing it together. It gives me a little bit of hope. So yeah, so thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Aarti. And thank you all for being here, who were here live, and who are going to be watching the recording. I believe Aarti is going to send some resources. So Weekly Dharma Gathering will send them out to everyone who's registered. And I also just want to give you thank you for coming, and to consider becoming a subscriber if you're not already. We have a 7-day free trial that you can find on our website. So I think I put that in earlier in the chat. I can just put it again. And next week's talk is going to be pre-recorded because it's inauguration day. I mean, we'll see. I'll actually be giving a talk, and it's currently titled, because I had titled it a couple of months ago, it's about compassionate wrath, but I think I'm going to tweak it a little bit. So please join us next week. Won't be live, but the recording will be released on Wednesday. And the following week, Sheena Brockington Taylor will be teaching on compassion practices. So thank you, everyone. Please follow us on Instagram at Weekly Dharma and on Facebook at Weekly Dharma Gathering. Thank you again, Aarti. If you want to just take us away or say any last words, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I will be sending out some resources. So hopefully if you want to just dive right in there, I'll send one resource that is a really great little short film. It's 45 minutes long, and it's a community that's actually did this and that is like, and is thriving doing it, and is working with people, and it's some really like, it's around incest. So it is like really hardcore, difficult stuff, and it's not just like small, harms, it's major harms. And it's the Native community in Canada, and they really have, done this work. And there's so much to learn from that it can be done in a community. And so it's beautiful. I'll send it to you. It's about 45 minutes long. It's filmed in like the 80s. So everyone has these 80s haircuts, but the community still exists, and they have all sorts of resources on their page and stuff. So I will send that all to you. Pod mapping stuff, I'll send to you. So yeah, I really appreciate being with you tonight. And yeah, please feel free. I can also send out my information. So if you have questions that come up later, you're welcome to email me too. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.